This Warhammer 40k terrain came from the Command Edition from the 9th edition rule set. This is where most of the Necron models I painted on this channel came from, though I still have yet to paint the Space Marines. To start on the terrain, I first primed them with black using an airbrush. I then give each piece an anti-zenithal spray of blue from right to left. I'll give an overview of all the steps in this video, but just be aware I do some experimenting along the way, and ultimately there are multiple steps that can just be skipped to still get the end result. I'll point those out specifically before the end of the video, as well as explain why I tried it out. Next, I give another anti-zenithal spray of an orangish brown from left to right, which I like as it gives me an impression of a setting sun and the failing light's last grasp. When I've done this in the past, I would do a lighter blue and orange yellow from above and from the same directions as their respective anti-zenithal counterparts, but this time I tried a sharp zenithal of off-white from directly above. I think my original method of lighter tones from the same family looks better, but I already know that I'll be applying oil washes later, so I wasn't too worried about how this came out, though I would not do this again personally. I then add a little discoloration of green for some interesting shadows, and at this point, the nice blue and orange contrast has nearly been obliterated. And though I honestly didn't need to, I decided I'd give all of the pieces a quick dusting of matte varnish, as my plan is to use a lot of thinners on these pieces in combinations that I've not used before, so I figured better safe than sorry. Next, I start lightly dabbing on AK Interactive's Corrosion Texture Paste. I went light and slow. It's pretty easy to get heavy-handed with this stuff, so I made sure to water it down and gently apply it repeatedly, to have a gradual build and not completely lose all of the details. I tried my best to keep this to the metal parts only and avoided the concrete. Well, I guess it would be called Rockcrete or Ferrocrete in the 31st millennium. This step by far took the longest in the project, eating up 6 hours worth of work spread out over multiple days over the 12 pieces in this set. As if in stark contrast to the lengthy time sink that was the application of the texture paste, the next step of applying black, brown, red, and yellow oil washes took only about an hour to finish. I applied the black wash all over first, before coming back and dabbing in red, brown, and yellow with light touches here and there to add some variation in color from natural staining from rust in the environment. This hour working time does not include the time I let the oil sit, which was roughly 45 minutes, before I gently wiped the excess from the upraised areas using a makeup sponge that was very lightly dampened with mineral spirits. Over the last few years, I went batshit in the hobby and just started buying things. Things that I never used before and sat in a drawer for years, like this AK Interactive Crusted Rust Deposits enamel, which I finally cracked into. Fair warning, the odor on these are pretty strong and I had to crack the window and turn the fan on to avoid a headache. But otherwise it was an enjoyable product and it was easy to use. I just dabbed a little out of the cap sporadically over the rusted metal areas to make them look more, well, rusted. It goes on pretty vibrant, but when it dries it becomes noticeably duller. In that same drawer, right next to the long neglected Crusted Rust Deposits enamel, waited AK Interactive's Streaking Grime, which I also liberated after long last. This I also applied straight out of the bottle cap, dragging it in recesses and from cracks in the pipe, or where filth and debris would collect from wind and rain. In the aforementioned legendary drawer of unused high-being paraphernalia also lurked AK Interactive's White Spirits. This I dampened a synthetic brush with. Actually, as a side note, I only use cheap synthetic brushes in this entire project. Anyway, with the dampened synthetic brush, I lightly wipe at the streaking grime spots to soften the edges and make it look more like a stain built over time. You can repeat the grime application and softening with spirits to create different intensities of stains. This step was the third longest as far as how long it took to accomplish, clocking in at approximately 2 hours of work. I made sure to go work on 3 to 4 pieces at a time, as I only waited about 15 minutes before coming back with the white spirits, so that the grime didn't completely dry before muting it. Now, with Mr. Hobby's multi-black and solvent mixed, I created a black pen wash that I tried my best to only apply to the edges and recesses. However, the corrosion texture paste made it a little difficult to control. Despite that, it still succeeded and it made smaller details such as the rivets and pipe banding easier to see. I decided to add two acrylic highlights, one for the rusty metals and one for the edges and tops of the Rockcrete walls. I used an orange-red for the rust using a way past its prime brush that I did rough dry brushing and dabs with. This I did sparingly as I wanted a lot of the various colors from the different oils and products used previously to remain visible. The second highlight was done with an off-white that I only applied as a broken edge highlight. The highlighting steps, as simple as I kept them, took the second longest in the project, clocking in at 4 hours of work over the 12 pieces. At this point I had 3 major steps, each containing multiple smaller parts, that I had planned out that I wanted to accomplish, with the next being some simple glowing lights. I'm already way past the point of feeling burnt out on this terrain set, so I decided to keep it simple and instead of doing airbrushing, which honestly wouldn't have taken long at all, but having to deal with the Georgia heat and the summer humidity in the workshop, yeah, no. Instead, I just hit all the sources with white ink that was minimally thinned with water so it flows easily. I then add a quick gloss varnish with the brush. If you're using inks or any type of contrast or speed paints that are not Army Painter speed paints, you can skip the varnish. But I found, at least when Liquitex and Dalerana inks are used, the alcohol in the Army Painter speed paints just destroys the ink. You can take a quick look at my Guild Ball Masons video, link in the top right corner, to see this disastrous effect in action. Once the varnish was dry, I hit the lights with Ghillie Dew or Maize Yellow speed paints before adding some fluorescent acrylics for a single highlight or text on the small screens. To add the effect of glass, I used Tester's product that has a long ass name that ends with Window Maker. If you use this product, know that it's incredibly runny and hard to control, so don't try to apply it using the applicator neck. You'll have a mess and it'll run everywhere. To better control it, put a little on a plastic palette or bottle cap and use a cheap brush to dab it where you want it to go. You don't need to thin it down, it's already like painting with skim milk. It will go on as cloudy white, but after a few minutes, it'll leave a transparent glass-like sheen. For any areas that the Window Maker product got onto that was unintentional, I just applied a little of Army Painter's anti-shine matte varnish, such as the rusty metal frames around the lights. With only 2 major things left that I want to do, I tackle the next to last and reach deep into my drawer of rarely and never used items, pulling free my Vallejo pigment powders. I take the black, brown, and yellow onto a dry palette and mix this with a little bit of Vallejo's airbrush thinner. When the thinner dries, it will fix the pigment powders to the pieces. These go on as if they were mud splashed up, so I apply this mostly to the under areas. I apply a brown the heaviest, with the black and yellow ones being applied sparingly. I then use the pigments and airbrush thinner again, but in a different manner, to add an additional grime buildup. First applying pure thinner to where I want the debris to go, and then I sprinkle on dry pigment powders onto where the thinner was added. This gives you a similar result as to the corrosion texture paste I used near the beginning of the video, but with a finer end result, and it's perfect for building up a look of dirt and dust built up in the corners. With the finish line finally in sight, I move on to the final task that I wanted to do, which is to add some slime to the cracked piping. I'm not going to show the several failed attempts at this and just show the two methods that worked well with each other, which was to mix a UV resin with some green resin dye in a small blister kept from things like this D&D miniature packaging. If you don't have blister packs laying around, you can use a bottle cap, but the corner of the blister pack makes pouring it a little easier. Anyway, with the resin mixed, I lightly poured it to where I wanted and then immediately stood the terrain up so that it would run down in the direction that I required, and then I hit it with the UV light. I found that shaking the object gently helped speed the dripping of the thick resin. It also helped to do longer streaks of dripping fluid in small segments, building off of each other instead of trying to apply too much of it at the top and hope that it runs all the way down in one go. For the ends of the damaged piping, I poured the resin into the small hole to fill it, and then I laid down the piece and let the resin drip out onto the wax paper before immediately hitting it with the UV light. I then poured more resin directly onto the wax paper and then set the already cured resin down into it. Hitting it with the UV light again combined the two pools into one larger one. As I continued applying the resin, I learned that it was helpful to guide the long streaks with my mixing stick, dragging it to where I wanted, as well as applying a little extra here and there. When I was done, I took the UV light and made sure to hit all of the errant bits of resin that I spilled on my wax paper to cure it, before balling the wax paper and tossing it into the trash. I could then finally call this project complete. This is where I stopped. Despite what appears on paper to be a ton of steps, this project went very quickly, taking under 10 hours of work for 12 pieces of terrain, with 3 of those pieces being fairly large. So on average it took me roughly less than 1 hour of time to paint each piece. If I were to paint another set like this again, it would actually take less time, as I would skip the 2 anti-zenithal sprays and the green shadow spray. One could argue that I could also have skipped the oil wash steps, which should shave another 2 hours of total runtime. 8 hours for 12 pieces of terrain painted up sounds pretty good to me. I really like the rusted effect as well as the slime work. The edge highlights on the Rockcrete walls also really stand out. In the end, I was going for a dilapidated ruins look, but one that was somehow still functional, as is the case with much of the Warhammer 40k setting. For lessons learned, the anti-zenithal sprays looked good, but was ultimately covered up. I knew most of it was going to be lost, but I didn't expect it to be taken over by all the other effects that I added. I'll be doing those again on a completely different project, and if I didn't do all of the corrosion and rust effects, I think it would have been worth it. Another issue I had is that on some of the pieces, I didn't do enough gap filling, as I expected the corrosion texture to fill it in for me, and it did where I added enough. In the future, I need to make sure I do the gap filling regardless, just in case. The lights came out okay, and I think if I spent a little more time on the highlighting, it could have looked even better. Otherwise, for once, I don't think I really have that many self-critiques on this one. In fact, I kinda want to go buy a box of Death Guard Marines now and paint them to look a lot like how I painted this terrain, but with more green tones. The corrosion texture on their armor I think would look pretty good. I was happy that I finally got to dust off a lot of products that I've been sitting on and get to use them all in one project. I learned quite a bit from working with UV resin and getting better at applying it, as well as the pigment powders. I have other projects lined up where these techniques will definitely be good to have on hand. And that'll bring this video to its end. I hope you learned something or inspired to start or expand your own collection of war-torn, dilapidated ruins from a grim, dark universe where there is only war. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and if you like the content of this video and would like to see more, you can easily support the channel by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Jim with Working with Miniatures. I'm truly grateful for your time, and I bid you a fond farewell. Until the next video.